Thanks for that very elegant handover. So yes, thanks for bearing with us. I'm just going to run us through personal tax and benefit changes, and you might be hopefully thinking that I'm going to talk about only the changes the Chancellor announced, at which point this will be a very short presentation indeed. But no, instead I'm going to try and set that in the broader context. I'm going to start by looking at a classic IFS decile chart. So here we've got the whole UK population lined up with the poorest on the left and the richest on the right. And first we're going to show in cash terms the effect of the measures announced yesterday, which turns out to be one measure, the Class 4 NICS measure that we can model, and it looks like that. If instead of just looking at what was announced yesterday, we look at everything that's already been implemented or is due to be implemented over the course of this Parliament, and we look at the long-run impact of all of those changes, then this is the distributional impact of tax and benefit changes over this Parliament. So you can see what we're seeing is very significant losses, very large losses towards the bottom of the distribution, low-income households, and some small gains towards the top of the distribution. That's basically because the government is cutting working age benefits and also reducing taxes, and income tax is doing a large part of that. It's worth bearing in mind that that's only one part of the story. Jonathan was talking about what's happening to earnings inequality. This isn't the overall picture for what's happening to inequality. It's what the impact of tax and benefit changes are. And actually, a good part of this picture is explained by changes that are coming in next month, or at least explained by the long-run impact of those changes. So what's happening? Well, first, on income tax, the personal allowance, that's how much you can earn before you start to pay income tax at all, is rising to £11,500 next month, and the high rate threshold is rising to £45,000. Compared to just letting those thresholds rise in line with inflation, which is the default, that's going to cost the government £5.5 billion, relative to just leaving that since the start of this Parliament, and that's on top of the £8 billion that the coalition spent in the last Parliament on the same policies raising the personal allowance. One kind of perhaps niche but potentially significant point is that the Scottish Government is using its new powers to freeze the higher rate threshold at £43,000 in April. That's the first time there'll be a divergence in the income tax schedule between Scotland and the rest of the UK. But it's worth noting that because the Scottish Government doesn't control national insurance rules, that's going to create a £2,000 band of earnings where 52% is the marginal rate, because you're paying 12% of NICS and the higher rate of income tax. And that could get bigger, that band, if the UK government keeps the Conservative manifesto promise of a £50,000 personal allowance, and the Scottish Government just lets the high rate threshold rise in line with inflation. So what does the personal allowance mean for a low-income adult working full-time at the national living wage? So basically their net income in real terms this year is £12,500. By 2021 that would have risen to £13,500, and that's because their earnings are rising, the national living wage is rising in real terms, and because they're paying less tax as a result of a higher income tax personal allowance. There are other tax changes coming in April. I'm going to skate over them quite quickly. The first is the introduction of a transferable main residence allowance in inheritance tax. In layman's terms, that just means the effective IHT threshold for a couple will be £1 million in 2021, as long as their main house is worth £350,000 or more. The ISA limit is rising to £20,000 next month, and also lifetime ISAs will be open to 18 to 40-year-olds from next month. The big picture here is that these are part of a set of changes over recent years that have made tax treatment of non-pension saving, particularly in ISAs, more generous, at the same time as the tax treatment of pension saving has been becoming less generous. So that's tax. As Paul said, perhaps the more significant changes coming in April are on the benefit side. So first, some cuts to child-related benefits. Now, what are we talking about here? We're talking about tax credits and their successor universal credit. And the current rules are that basically if you have the first child in a household on tax credits, the maximum entitlement for that child is just over £3,000 a year. And then for every child after that, you get an additional nearly £3,000 a year. So what's changing? Well, from next month, newborn first children will no longer receive a higher entitlement, so that means they get the 2,700 number rather than the 3,300 number. And newborn third and subsequent children will no longer receive any support, so you lose nearly £3,000 for each child if you've got the maximum entitlement. So that all affects new births, families with children who are born after April 2017. But on top of that, from November 2018, new claims to UC will also receive no support for third and subsequent children, even if all the children in the relevant household are already born. So it's worth pointing out that these reforms create no kind of overnight cash losses because they only affect new births and then new claims, but they have a very significant long-run impact on the generosity of the system. So thinking just about limiting the child element to the first 2 children, that's going to save the government about £3 billion a year in the long run. And as Paul mentioned, that's basically because it reduces the entitlement of around 1 million low-income families with lots of children by very significant sums. A good chunk of those families are lone parents, and most of them are in work rather than workless. The abolition of the family element, that's the extra that the first child gets. In the long run, that will save the government about £2 billion a year by reducing the entitlement of all 4 million families on tax credits by about £500 a year. What does that mean for the generosity of support for children that our benefit system provides to low-income families? Well, what this chart shows is the additional benefit entitlement that a workless family receives with respect to each child. So 0 here is the entitlement of a family with no children, and you can see that roughly speaking they're getting about £4,000 for each child. That's the tax credit numbers I just gave you plus child benefit. So this is the situation in 2016. Now if we roll the clock forward to 2020, the real terms entitlements with respect to each child would be lower even without the reforms I'm talking about, even for existing claimants, because of the government's benefit freeze. But when you bring in both the abolition of the family element and the restriction of the child element to the first 2 children, the picture looks like that. So you can see very significant reductions in the support that these large families out of work or low income in work will be receiving. What does that mean for the kind of relative to the past? Well, it's worth noting that in real terms, the generosity of these benefits hasn't changed very much in the last 5 years. The 2011 bars are pretty similar to 2016 bars. And in fact, if we focus on families with 3 or more children, these reforms will reduce real entitlements below what they've been at any point under the modern tax credit system, so since child and working tax credit came in 2003. But if you go back to 1997, before the kind of tax credits as we know them now were in place, real entitlements were lower, although that's quite a long time frame to be looking over. So what can we say about this? Well, it does seem reasonable to think there might be some economies of scale within households, and so you might want to provide less support for 3rd and 4th children than 1st and 2nd children, say. But it's not clear why you'd want there to be somewhat of a cliff edge, this very sharp reduction in support where you get the full amount for the 2nd child and then nothing at all for the 3rd and later children. Obviously, big reductions in benefit entitlements do strengthen the incentives for people to be in work, but the decision to include new claims but not existing claims creates quite a weird incentive. So let me explain. Imagine I'm on tax credits, I've got 4 children, and I'm deciding whether to take a 1-year fixed-term contract that will give me enough income to get off tax credits. If I take that job, and then the contract's not renewed, I get put back onto the less generous system for new claims. So that says I might not want to risk coming off tax credits because then I'll be treated under the less generous set of rules. And the government's kind of stated rationale for this policy is to try to affect the decisions that low-income families take about the number of children to have. There is some evidence that fertility decisions, at least in terms of timing, respond to benefit reforms. But if that's your rationale, it's unclear why you'd want to affect new claims where all the children are already born. So what does all this mean? Well, let's take a lone parent with 3 teenage children in exactly the same labour market position as my first example. So again, working full-time on the national living wage. Her net household income in real terms after housing costs this year is just less than £22,000. Now, even if she stays on tax credits, all her children are already born, so she's not affected by these new reforms. Her net income is nearly £1,500 lower in 2020-21. She is gaining from the personal allowance and from the national living wage, but losing from the nominal freeze to tax credit rates. But the big point is, imagine an identical lone parent who's currently in a well-paid job not requiring tax credits, but makes a claim in 2020. Her net real income is £17,500, so about £3,000 less than the identical lone parent, because she also loses from the abolition of the child element for 3rd and subsequent children. Okay, so that's one major reform coming in April. Another one is the rather technically named the abolition of the work-related activity group component in employment and support allowance. What that means is that if I claim employment and support allowance, the government, I try and claim it, the government can either say, no, you're not disabled, you should be on JSA, or it can put me in a support group which says you're not capable of any form of work-related activity, or I can be in the work-related activity group, which is I'm not able to work right now, but I'm capable of work-related activity. At the moment, that group receives a premium of about £30 a week over the JSA rate. But for new claims from April, if you get put in that group, you don't get any premium at all. The long-run saving from that policy is a bit over £500 million, with 500,000 claimants losing £1,500 a year on average. And we reckon that it will affect about 50 to 100,000 people in the next year. What kind of people are these individuals in the work-related activity group? Well, one important thing to note is that in terms of the duration of their benefit claim, they look very different to JSA claimants. So 4 in 5 of them, current RAG claimants, have been claiming for over 2 years, compared to less than 1 in 5 of current JSA claimants. That might be relevant when you're thinking about what the appropriate level of support is to provide to these individuals. About half suffer from mental and behavioural disorders, rather than a physical disability being the main reason they're there. And one thing to note is that, as well as potentially creating incentive to try to get yourself work ready faster, this reform does massively increase the incentive to appeal the decision to put you in the work-related activity group, since if you get put back into the support group, that's now worth more than £30 a week. So what does that mean? Well, let's take a single adult in that relevant group. Their net income in 2016-17 is £5,400. Now, again, even if they made the claim last year, they're already on, and then they just wait until, they're just sitting on it until 2020-21, their real income is going down, and that's because of the nominal freeze affects both the basic and the work-related activity group components of ESA. But moreover, imagine an identical individual who makes the claim to work-related activity group, makes the claim to ESA next month or later. Their net income in 2021 is only £3,500. So there's your £1,500 loss. So to conclude, the Chancellor chose to make almost no changes to personal taxes and benefits yesterday, not that you'd know it from the amount of noise about the next change. But there are a number of important changes to the system that are coming in next month. Giveaways in income tax, inheritance tax and savings tax, and at the same time cuts to benefits for disabled and for the disabled and for low-income families with 3 or more children, actually in the long run for all families on tax credits. And as I've said, that these changes don't create big overnight losses because they affect new claims or new births, but in the long run they significantly reduce the generosity of the benefit system. And one of the effects of that is that, to be kind of informal, it's better to be poor now and stay poor than to get poor later. Because you want to be in the system now, treated under the existing rules, rather than being a new claimant in 2 or 3 years' time.